In 2011, the most rebellious subwoofer brand in America sold itself to the establishment. SVS, born in a Youngstown, Ohio garage, built massive, black-carpeted cylinder subwoofers that bypassed hi-fi dealers and shipped straight to American porches. They routinely crushed $2,500 retail speakers for a fraction of the price. But following the corporate buyout, home theater purists suddenly watched their fiercely independent, internet direct secret swap its signature rough fabric for a piano gloss finish to sit proudly on Magnolia retail shelves. A decade earlier, the SVS name meant a total rejection of the American stereo store markup. Now, the brand was fighting to become the very retail giant it had once mocked. But the real story of SVS is not just the story of a corporate buyout. It is the story of how the internet killed the American hi-fi showroom, and what happened when the rebels finally became the establishment. Every week, we tell the stories of the American speakers, audio brands, and listening rooms that once shaped how people heard music and movies, and what happened when the market moved on. Subscribe if that history matters to you. The story begins not with nostalgia, but with a specific place. In a Youngstown, Ohio garage in 1998. In 1998, the American living room was undergoing a violent, invisible transition. For decades, stereo listening had been a two-channel affair. But the late 1990s brought the DVD format into American homes, and with it came the discrete 5.1 Dolby Digital soundtrack. The point one was the low-frequency effects channel, or LFE. Hollywood mixing engineers were suddenly sending subterranean bass signals, frequencies dropping to 20 Hz and below, directly into the suburban American basement. But American audio retail was not ready for the physics of cinema sound. A subwoofer, a speaker designed to reproduce very low bass frequencies, requires moving massive amounts of air to create physical pressure in a room. To move that much air efficiently, the speaker requires a large enclosure. If a buyer walked into a traditional stereo store or a big box retailer in 1998 looking for cinema-level bass, they faced a grim retail reality. The subwoofers on the showroom floor were usually small, underpowered wooden cubes designed to hide behind a couch. They produced a muddy, localized thump, but they could not reach the 20 Hz depths required by modern cinema. The few hi-fi brands that did build capable subterranean subwoofers priced them as luxury items. A home theater enthusiast could easily find themselves staring at a $2,500 price tag for a single bass cabinet. The American retail model, with its distributor margins, dealer network commissions, and expensive showroom real estate, demanded those high prices. The actual cost of the woofer driver and the amplifier inside the box was a fraction of what the customer paid. The problem was not acoustic engineering. The problem was retail economics. In Youngstown, Ohio, a working-class city built on the memory of steel manufacturing, two audio enthusiasts named Ron Stimson and Tom Vodenell were studying this exact gap in the market. They were not corporate executives. They were passionate home theater builders who frequented the nascent audio communities on the internet, specifically the early home theater forums. Stimson and Vodenell looked at the $2,500 retail subwoofers and realized that the physics of deep bass did not require luxury furniture pricing. Bass simply required air volume, a capable woofer, a large driver designed to reproduce low frequencies, such as bass and drums, and sufficient amplifier power. The expensive part of a traditional high-end subwoofer was the meticulously veneered, internally braced, heavy wooden cabinet, and the dealer network required to sell it. If they could figure out a way to build a massive enclosure cheaply and sell it without a dealer, they could deliver seismic bass to the American middle class. In 1998, SVC Aun began in a Youngstown garage. The letters stood for Stimson and Vodenell. Rather than building expensive wooden cubes, they turned to a radically utilitarian shape, the cylinder. A rigid tube required less internal bracing than a square box, naturally suppressed internal standing waves, and provided a massive amount of internal air volume. More importantly, it was incredibly cheap to manufacture. They wrapped the cardboard-like composite tubes in industrial black fabric, capped the ends with wood, and installed high-excursion drivers and powerful amplifiers. The resulting object did not look like a traditional piece of American hi-fi equipment. It looked like an industrial water heater. It was imposing, unrefined, and visually dominating. But when plugged into a home theater receiver, the garage-built cylinder did exactly what the $2,500 showroom subwoofers did, often with significantly greater physical impact. The acoustic problem was solved, but a new structural problem emerged. The American audio industry operated almost entirely through local stereo stores and authorized hi-fi dealers. These dealers controlled what the public heard. A brand without a dealer network essentially did not exist. Furthermore, a subwoofer is a deeply physical experience. A buyer needs to feel the pressure in the room to understand the value of the speaker. Stimson and Vodenal had no showrooms. They had no distribution network. They had no marketing budget to buy full-page advertisements in major stereo magazines. Instead, they turned to the exact place where their own frustration had been born: the internet. In the late 1990s, the concept of buying a heavy, expensive speaker directly from a website, without ever hearing it first, was completely foreign to the American audio consumer. But the communities on AVS Forum and other home theater message boards were desperate for a solution to the $2,500 bass monopoly. When SVS began offering their massive cylinder subwoofers for a fraction of the cost of retail competitors, the proposition was too intriguing to ignore. The early reception was entirely grassroots. A few daring home theater enthusiasts took a chance on the strange black-carpeted tubes from Ohio. When the massive boxes arrived on American porches, the buyers carried them into their basements, connected their receivers, and played the most demanding DVD soundtracks they owned. The results were immediately documented online. On forums where audio enthusiasts obsessed over frequency response and peak output, the early reviews were uniformly shocked. The SVS cylinders were hitting 20 Hz with punishing authority, shaking drywall and rattling windows, performing alongside or outperforming the most expensive luxury subwoofers on the traditional market. These first buyers became evangelists. They posted their impressions, measured their room responses, and defended the brand against traditional audiophiles who dismissed the utilitarian design. A community began to form around the idea that American buyers were being systematically overcharged by the hi-fi retail establishment, and that two guys in a Youngstown garage had discovered the cheat code. By 1999, the demand for the cylinders began to outpace the limits of a garage operation. SVS was no longer a weekend experiment. It was a functioning audio company, entirely dependent on word-of-mouth trust and the speed of internet forums. They had solved the physics of cheap, deep bass. Now, they had to figure out how to sell a speaker that no American listener could test in a store. The breakthrough of SVS did not happen under the carefully aimed acoustic lighting of a traditional American stereo store. It happened on the concrete porches of suburban homes, often to the profound confusion of the delivery drivers tasked with dropping the boxes off. To understand the disruption that SVS caused in the early 2000s, one must understand the physical reality of what an early customer actually received. When an American buyer ordered one of the original CS or PCI series cylinder subwoofers, they were taking a blind leap of faith. When an American buyer ordered one of the original CS or PCI series cylinder subwoofers, they were taking a blind leap of faith. They had never heard the product, they had never touched it. When the cardboard shipping box arrived, it was roughly the size of a household water heater. Inside was a colossal tube, often standing 3 to 4 feet tall, wrapped entirely in an industrial-grade black carpet that felt more appropriate for a car trunk or a touring band's equipment rack than a formal domestic space. It looked absolutely nothing like traditional hi-fi furniture. There was no fine walnut wood grain. There was no meticulously applied lacquer. There was only a monolithic utilitarian cylinder capped with wood, dominating whatever corner of the room it was placed in. But the strange towering shape was not a gimmick. It was an acoustic masterstroke designed to solve a very specific physical problem. To create deep bass, a speaker requires massive internal air volume. A traditional speaker cabinet, the wooden, plastic, or composite box that holds the drivers and shapes how the speaker interacts with the air, requires thick, expensive wooden walls and heavy internal bracing to prevent the box itself from vibrating and ruining the sound. If a manufacturer builds a square wooden box large enough to hit 20 Hz, it becomes incredibly heavy, extremely expensive to ship, and requires a massive footprint on the living room floor. The cylinder bypassed all of these problems simultaneously. A tubular shape is naturally rigid. It does not require heavy internal cross-bracing to prevent the walls from flexing. By building vertically, SVS maximized the internal air volume while requiring only a 16-inch footprint on the floor. This immense internal space allowed the woofer, the large driver designed to physically push air and reproduce low frequencies, to operate with devastating efficiency. It also allowed the engineers to install massive tuning ports. A port, a precisely measured opening in a speaker cabinet that uses moving air to reinforce bass output, needs to be long and wide to move large volumes of air without creating distracting wind noise. The tall cylinder provided the perfect physical runway for these deep breathing ports. The result was a machine built strictly for acoustic violence, stripped of every cosmetic luxury that traditional retail demanded. And because it was stripped of cosmetic luxury, it broke the pricing model of the American audio industry. In the early 2000s, if an enthusiast wanted a subwoofer capable of reaching the subsonic depths of a modern Hollywood DVD soundtrack, they had to visit a specialized hi-fi dealer. The dealer would demonstrate a beautifully finished, heavy wooden subwoofer from an established luxury brand. The price tag would routinely hover around $2,500. SVS delivered the equivalent, and often superior, physical performance directly to the buyer's door for under $1,000. For the price of a standard mid-range home theater receiver, an American listener could suddenly acquire reference-level cinematic bass. This price disparity was the moat that traditional stereo stores could not cross. The retail audio market operated on a strict, multi-tiered economic system. A factory built the speaker, a distributor took a percentage to move it, a regional representative took a cut, and the local stereo store doubled the wholesale price to keep the lights on and pay the salesman on the floor. SVS had no distributors, no representatives, and no salesmen. By utilizing a pure direct-to-consumer model, every dollar the customer spent went into the driver, the amplifier, the massive enclosure, and the shipping cost. However, a direct-to-consumer audio company cannot survive without trust, and trust was historically built in the listening room of the local stereo store. SVS had to build a new kind of trust in a completely new venue: the internet. The revolution was driven by a handful of highly specific, fiercely analytical online communities. AVS forums served as ground zero for the home theater boom. As early adopters took a chance on the black carpeted cylinders, they documented their experiences with obsessive detail. They measured the frequency response in their basements. They posted graphs proving that the SVS tubes were playing flat down to 20 Hz and below. Soon the word spread beyond a single message board. Communities like Audioholics, Home Theater Shack, and the Home Theater Forum began testing, debating, and ultimately validating the SVS design. Traditional print media, which relied heavily on advertising dollars from retail speaker brands, could no longer ignore the grassroots momentum. Magazines like Widescreen Review and Sound and Vision eventually had to acknowledge the sheer physical capability of the internet direct cylinders. This was a profound shift in American listening culture. For the first time, a buyer in a suburban living room was trusting the measured graphs and typed reviews of strangers on the internet over the verbal promises of a local hi-fi dealer. The local salesman, who was used to controlling the home theater narrative, suddenly found himself trying to convince a customer not to buy a massive black tube they had read about online. But the salesman could not alter the physics of bass, and he could not alter the retail markup required to keep his store open. The grassroots internet trust became an impenetrable shield for SVS. If a new buyer was hesitant about sending $850 to a relatively unknown company in Ohio, a dozen forum members would immediately reply with stories of the company's legendary customer service. If an amplifier failed, SVS did not tell the customer to drive it to a local repair center. They shipped a replacement part directly to the house with instructions on how to install it. They had taken the oldest rule of American audio retail, that a speaker must be heard in a showroom before it is purchased, and entirely destroyed it. The brand was no longer a weekend garage experiment. It was a functioning, highly profitable disruptor, armed with an army of internet evangelists and a product that physically overwhelmed the competition. The cylinder had bypassed the showroom. Now, the company had to prove it could dominate the rest of the living room. By the mid-2000s, the Youngstown garage could no longer contain the physical reality of the company's success. SVS was no longer an underground experiment shared among a few daring early adopters. It had become the gravitational center of the American home theater boom. The company moved out of the garage and into a dedicated manufacturing and assembly facility in Ohio. This was not a pristine, acoustic laboratory with polished floors and ambient showroom lighting. It was a working-class assembly floor built to process heavy wood, dense composites, massive magnet structures, and miles of black industrial carpet. The internet had given SVS a megaphone, but the product still had to deliver physical violence to the room. The original cylinder subwoofers had proven the concept, but to truly dominate the American listening space, Stimson and Vodanell knew they had to expand. Some buyers simply could not integrate a towering, water heater-sized tube into their domestic spaces. The market demanded a traditional footprint, even if the traditional footprint was inherently compromised. SVS responded by taking the acoustic philosophy of the cylinder and forcing it into a wooden box. But in typical SVS fashion, they refused to compromise the internal air volume. The resulting products, like the legendary PB12 Plus 2, were absolute monsters. The PB12 Plus 2 was a ported box subwoofer, a massive wooden cabinet utilizing tuned circular openings to reinforce extremely low frequencies that weighed nearly 140 pounds. It utilized twin 12-inch woofers firing down toward the floor, powered by a massive internal amplifier. It was so large and so heavy that it required 2 adults to safely move it into a room. There was nothing subtle about it. It was wrapped in the same brutalist, textured black finish as the cylinders, defying every cosmetic rule of the high-end stereo store. But the sheer scale of the cabinet allowed it to produce terrifying levels of bass. It did not just play loud, it played deep, effortlessly reaching the subsonic 16 Hz region where human hearing stops and purely physical sensation begins. In an American suburban basement in the early 2000s, a black carpeted cylinder, or a massive PB12 Plus/2, was not just furniture. It was a pressure machine. The only thing that could make a T-Rex roar feel physically real in the room without a $5,000 price tag. The brand's reach expanded with ruthless efficiency, entirely bypassing the traditional retail network. Without a single hi-fi dealer taking a commission, SVS began shipping thousands of these massive units directly to front porches across the country. They established a logistics pipeline that treated 140-pound audio equipment like standard mail. The delivery drivers hated them, but the customers revered them. The American audio landscape was being permanently redrawn by word of mouth. SVS became the undisputed reference standard on AVS Forum. It dominated the rigorous measurements and reviews on Audioholics. It became the default recommendation on the Home Theater Shack message boards. From dedicated, soundproofed basements in Ohio, to sprawling new construction home theaters in Texas, to college dorm rooms in California and packed living rooms in Florida, the black carpeted boxes were replacing the expensive, underperforming retail brands. The traditional stereo showrooms, which had once dictated exactly what the American public was allowed to buy, were suddenly forced to answer for their prices. Customers would walk into a Magnolia store or a local hi-fi shop, listen to a beautiful $2,000 polished wood subwoofer, and tell the salesman that an $899 black box from Ohio could play deeper, cleaner, and louder. The salesman had no defense, because the physics and the forums were entirely on the side of SVS. By the height of the DVD and early Blu-ray era, SVS was generating millions of dollars in direct-to-consumer revenue. They were moving thousands of units out of their Ohio facility. They had expanded their product lines to include multiple tiers of cylinders, massive ported boxes, and sealed box subwoofers, closed cabinets that used trapped air to control the woofer, offering a smaller footprint for tighter spaces. They had achieved the ultimate grassroots victory. Two home theater enthusiasts had built an independent American speaker empire without ever kissing the ring of a single audio distributor. SVS had built the perfect American bass machine. But the machine had grown too large for the two men who built it, and the scale of their success was about to force a dangerous transition. To understand the absolute dominance of SVS in the mid-2000s, one must look at what was happening inside the American home. This was the golden age of the dedicated home theater build. Across the country, the unfinished suburban basement was being transformed into a private cinema. The rollout of the Blu-ray disc format introduced lossless audio tracks to the consumer market, delivering uncompressed, studio-grade sound directly into residential spaces. Hollywood sound designers were engineering movies with massive dynamic range, utilizing subsonic frequencies to convey the physical weight of explosions, earthquakes, and spaceship engines. But a massive room requires massive air movement. The physics of room acoustics, the way walls, floors, ceilings, and furniture change the sound after it leaves the speaker, dictate that low frequencies behave like water, filling the space and losing energy rapidly over distance. To properly pressurize a large American basement, a listener could not rely on the bundled subwoofers sold at Circuit City. Those mass-market systems often relied on a cheap, passive radiator, a speaker-like cone without a voice coil that moves with air pressure to reinforce bass, stuffed into a tiny plastic box. They produced a hollow booming noise that completely fell apart when tasked with reproducing real cinematic weight. SVS became the mandatory upgrade. The brand's dominance on the internet translated into physical reality across the country. In a custom-built home theater in Texas, it was not uncommon to find two towering SVS cylinders flanking a projection screen. In a cramped college dorm room in California, a single PCI cylinder took up an entire corner, completely overwhelming the structural limits of the building. In Florida living rooms, the massive PB12+2 wooden boxes served as end tables, vibrating the couches with every low-frequency sweep. The community of owners grew fiercely protective of the brand. When a new user on a home theater forum asked for a subwoofer recommendation under $1,000, the response was immediate and unified. The traditional hi-fi brands that relied on dealer networks simply stopped competing in the extreme low-frequency category online. If an audio company was paying a local stereo store a 50% margin just to place a subwoofer on a showroom floor, they could not afford to put enough amplifier power or driver magnet into the box to compete with the direct-to-consumer machines coming out of Ohio. As the orders multiplied, SVS realized they had to adapt to a wider demographic. The black industrial carpet that had defined their rebellious garage origins was highly practical, but it was visually aggressive. To enter more formal American living rooms, the company began offering their massive wooden boxes in premium finishes. They introduced real wood veneer, a thin layer of attractive wood used on the outside of a speaker cabinet to give it the appearance of solid timber, and high-gloss piano black options. They were beginning to look like the luxury hi-fi brands they had once mocked, but they were doing it at a scale and price point that traditional audio retail could not touch. By its peak in the late 2000s, SVS was operating an impressive logistics machine. The company was receiving drivers, amplifiers, and raw cabinet materials, assembling massive bass systems, and shipping thousands of heavy units out of their Ohio facility every year. The forums were flooded with pictures of the SVS grin, the visceral reaction of an American listener hearing their walls flex for the first time. They were receiving universal praise from major trade publications. They had built a multi-million-dollar American audio empire entirely outside the boundaries of the traditional stereo store system. This was the peak of the grassroots era. The founders had successfully bypassed the retail middlemen. They had utilized the internet to build absolute, unshakable consumer trust. They had engineered a product line that physically dominated the American listening room. But extreme growth forces a company to change its nature. SVS was no longer a two-man operation shipping carpeted tubes out of a garage. It was a massive electronics manufacturer relying on a complex, global supply chain. The sheer volume of orders meant they were constantly navigating the rising costs of raw materials, shipping logistics, and customer service demands. When a company is shipping hundreds of 100-pound boxes directly to consumers every week, the margins for error vanish. The internet forum culture that had birthed the company was built on the idea of accessibility and direct communication with the founders. But as the company scaled, the founders were no longer just building subwoofers. They were managing a sprawling corporate entity. The strength of the direct-to-consumer model, the ability to sell massive performance for a low price, was slowly becoming a trap. To grow larger, to reach the millions of American buyers who did not read AVS Forum and still wanted to buy their electronics in a physical store, SVS would need a massive influx of capital. They would need executive retail experience. They would need to rethink their entire aesthetic. The company had conquered the internet, but to conquer the rest of the market, the rebellious identity of the Ohio garage would have to be left behind. The decline of the original SVS identity did not begin with a catastrophic failure of a subwoofer. It began quietly, in 2007, with a resignation. Tom Vodenell, the chief engineer and the V in SVC, left the company he had co-founded. For the thousands of American home theater enthusiasts who had built their private basement cinemas around his acoustic designs, the departure was a jarring signal. The internet forums noticed immediately. The direct, grassroots line of communication between the men who designed the massive cylinders and the enthusiasts who bought them was beginning to sever. Vodenell's exit was the first small crack in the foundation. But the larger fracture was structural. The grassroots empire was colliding with the ruthless reality of American audio market forces. Force 1. The rising costs of cabinets, drivers, magnets, labor, and domestic manufacturing was catching up to the Ohio operation. Building massive, heavy enclosures and shipping them directly to consumers works perfectly when a company is small and overhead is low. But SVS was now moving thousands of units. A 140-pound PB12 plus 2 required massive magnet structures, thick wooden walls, and heavy packaging. As fuel and freight costs rose globally, the logistics of treating small refrigerators like standard parcel mail became a massive financial liability. Every time a delivery driver dropped a 100-pound cylinder onto a concrete porch, the risk of a damaged voice coil, the coil of wire attached to the speaker cone that moves when electricity passes through it, or a cracked cabinet increased. The legendary replacement part customer service that had built the brand was becoming unsustainably expensive to maintain at an industrial scale. Force 2. Hi-fi dealers, big box retail, and online price pressure was also changing the landscape. The internet direct model had allowed SVS to bypass the stereo store markup, but the market was shifting again. The dedicated, soundproofed home theater room was becoming a luxury niche. The average American buyer no longer wanted a massive, black carpeted cylinder dominating their living room. They wanted a soundbar, a long, narrow speaker system designed to sit near a television and replace multiple home theater cabinets. The mass market demanded convenience, wireless connectivity, and a small footprint. Families were integrating flat-screen televisions into open-concept living spaces, and the tolerance for brutalist audio furniture was rapidly disappearing. If SVS remained purely a direct-to-consumer niche brand selling giant boxes to hardcore enthusiasts, they risked stagnation as the extreme base market shrank. To survive and grow, they needed to expand their product lines. They needed to build full-range traditional speakers. They needed to develop smaller sealed subwoofers. They needed to compete globally. But a company cannot transition from a specialized, direct-to-consumer subwoofer manufacturer to a global consumer electronics empire on the cash flow of internet forum sales alone. They needed massive capital, sophisticated supply chain management, and executive retail experience. In 2011, the breaking point arrived. Ron Stimpson sold SVS to an investment group led by Gary Yakubian, a seasoned audio industry executive and the former president of Magnolia Home Theater, the premium audio division operating inside Best Buy. It was a moment of profound psychological dissonance for the American home theater community. For over a decade, SVS had weaponized the internet to destroy the American stereo store markup. Their entire identity was built on being the anti-retail brand, the company that proved traditional hi-fi showrooms were systematically overcharging the middle class. The SVS badge had been a symbol of rebellion, a secret handshake among listeners who knew how to read a frequency response graph. Now, they were owned by the very retail establishment they had mocked. The buyout was not a hostile takeover designed to kill the company. It was a calculated rescue operation designed to scale it. Yakubian and his team understood the brand's immense equity, but they also understood the economic ceiling of the garage model. The company relocated its headquarters from Youngstown, Ohio, to Maryland. The operations were modernized. The global supply chain was tightened to ensure profitability. SVS was safe from bankruptcy, but the transition activated Force 4, corporate consolidation and brand dilution. The badge remained. The listening culture behind it permanently changed. Under the new leadership, the product strategy fundamentally shifted. The new SVS could not rely entirely on hardcore forum members who tolerated raw aesthetics. To justify the corporate investment and achieve global scale, the brand had to appeal to the broader American middle class. They had to look like a premium product that a buyer would expect to see in a high-end retail environment. They needed to build not just subwoofers, but complete home theater packages, bookshelf speakers, center channels, and tower speakers designed to compete with legacy brands like Klipsch and Polk. The signature industrial black carpet, the utilitarian fabric that had wrapped the original cylinders and early box subwoofers, signaling maximum performance over cosmetic luxury, was stripped away. In its place came premium black ashwood veneers and flawless piano gloss finishes. The towering, intimidating shapes were slowly phased out or redesigned to look more refined, more acceptable to interior decorators, and more appropriate for a modern, mixed-use living room. The new speakers were undeniably beautiful, and the engineering remained highly capable. But to the early adopters on AVS Forum, the heavy polish felt like a quiet rejection of the original premise. The company was no longer an underground secret. The garage era was officially dead. Now, the new executives had to figure out how to sell a rebellious internet brand to the exact retail stores it had spent a decade trying to destroy. Swifty Begin, the corporate acquisition by Gary Yakubian's investment group in 2011, did not halt the engineering output of SVS, but it completely redirected its ambitions. The brand was no longer a grassroots experiment operating on the fringes of the mainstream audio market. It was a professional consumer electronics enterprise engineered for growth, distribution, and broad retail compliance. The changes were immediate and systemic. The company's headquarters shifted from Youngstown, Ohio to Maryland, embedding the brand directly into the administrative and distribution hubs of the mid-Atlantic audio industry. The workforce expanded to include logistics managers, marketing executives, and retail liaisons who understood how to negotiate shelf space with national electronics chains. The manufacturing process itself underwent a quiet, thorough overhaul. While the heavy wood fabrication and cabinet assembly had previously relied on regional American suppliers and hands-on garage-style adjustments, the new leadership optimized the supply chain. Raw materials, driver components, and amplifier boards were increasingly standardized, sourced through stable international partnerships, and assembled with strict quality control to eliminate the costly warranty failures that had threatened to burden the brand during its rapid scaling phase. The product lineup reflected the new economic reality. The intimidating, towering cylinder subwoofers that had defined the brand's rebellious origins were gradually relegated to legacy status, or completely redesigned. In their place came a sleek, comprehensive catalog of compact sealed subwoofers, beautifully veneered ported boxes, and full-range architectural speakers. The aesthetic evolution was absolute. The industrial black carpet, the utilitarian fabric that had once signaled a pure dedication to performance over superficial decoration, was entirely phased out. Every new SVS product was now wrapped in real wood veneers or finished with multi-layer piano gloss lacquers that could sit comfortably beside luxury European hi-fi brands in high-end living rooms. This visual and structural transformation culminated in the ultimate institutional crossing over. SVS secured national distribution inside Best Buy and its premium custom installation division, Magnolia Home Theater. For the early adopters, who had spent the early 2000s evangelizing the brand on AVS Forum as the ultimate weapon against the high-end retail establishment, the sight of SVS subwoofers resting on polished retail display shelves next to mainstream commercial audio brands was a strange, bittersweet reality. The Rebel had successfully integrated into the empire. Yet, the engineering core managed to retain a surprising degree of credibility. Unlike many legacy audio companies whose acquisitions resulted in hollowed-out brand names, stamping cheap plastic components, SVS continued to invest heavily in electroacoustic research. They developed sophisticated digital signal processing, or DSP, microprocessor technology that digitally corrects and optimizes speaker performance, allowing their relatively compact subwoofers to defy the physical limitations of their enclosures. Their amplifiers grew more powerful, their drivers more resilient, and their measurement-driven design philosophy remained completely intact. The brand survived the perilous transition from a niche internet secret to a global loudspeaker powerhouse. But the transition permanently erased the unique communal intimacy of the Youngstown garage. The showroom went quiet. The forums lost their exclusive secret. The industrial carpet disappeared. The badge moved on to retail shelves. The old stereo rack fell silent. The new consumer took their place. The transition of SVS from a garage-built internet startup to a global consumer electronics provider is a definitive study in the evolution of American audio commerce. The brand did not survive by clinging to the defiant, unpolished identity that launched it in 1998. It survived by accepting the structural reality of the market. When a company grows past the limits of a regional workshop, it must either adapt to global supply chains and modern retail channels, or shrink into obscurity. SVS chose growth, trading its industrial black carpet and rebellious isolation for piano gloss finishes and retail shelf space in Best Buy. Today, the secondary market and vintage audio preservation communities tell the other side of that story. On online forums, enthusiast marketplaces, and local classified ads, a thriving subculture exists dedicated entirely to preserving the early SVS era. Collectors hunt down the massive original cylinder subwoofers. Audiophiles swap tips on recapping vintage amplifiers and replacing worn driver surrounds. They treat the heavy, unrefined boxes built in Youngstown not as obsolete electronics, but as historic artifacts of a unique moment when the internet briefly allowed two enthusiasts to bypass the entire hi-fi retail establishment. For those who still own a functional, carpeted cylinder from the early 2000s, the appeal is entirely practical. An old American subwoofer with massive internal volume, a robust driver, and a restored amplifier can still move physical air in a way that modern, ultra-slim home theater speakers struggle to replicate. Not because it is old, but because low-frequency physics do not change. Sound still begins where heavy cones push against room air. As for the physical site in Youngstown, where the operation first took root, the original garage has long since moved on to other residential uses. The industrial units that house the early assembly floors have folded back into the quiet manufacturing history of the Rust Belt. But the blueprint they left behind permanently altered how American audio companies approach distribution, proving that consumer trust could be built directly through digital communities, rather than physical showrooms. A curious footnote remains in the modern audio landscape. The founder who walked away from SVS in 2007 did not leave the speaker business. Tom Vodenell established a new direct-to-consumer loudspeaker company, continuing to build high-output subwoofers for dedicated home theater enthusiasts who prefer raw performance over retail aesthetics. keeping the spirit of the early Internet Direct movement alive in a modern market. The evolution of SVS reveals a permanent truth about how America builds, sells, and discards sound. The market constantly praises innovation, but it ultimately rewards convenience, accessibility, and mainstream retail polish. The gap between what enthusiasts demand, uncompromised performance, direct engineering access, and radical value, and what the mass market purchases, sleek integration, brand recognition, and retail availability, will always force a choice. SVS chose survival through scale. Somewhere in an American basement, a towering carpeted cylinder still stands beside a home theater receiver, its industrial fabric faded, its heavy magnet waiting for a low-frequency sweep and one more movie to shake the room. Every week we tell the stories of American speakers, audio brands, and listening rooms that once shaped how people heard music and movies, and what happened when the market moved on. Subscribe if that history matters to you. See you in the next video.